guest today is Tom Glynn, the newly appointed chair of the MBTA Board of Directors. Mr. Glynn is new to the T Board, but he is not new to big, complex organizations. Over the course of his career, he has served as Deputy Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton, General Manager of the MBTA under Mike Dukakis, CEO of the Massachusetts Port Authority, and the head of Harvard University's Alston Land Company. Tom, what made you want to return to the T, particularly at such a low point for the Transit Authority?
Well, I have to give credit to Governor Healy. She's a very persuasive person, and I raised a couple of concerns, and she addressed them. And, it's obviously one of the most important institutions in our community. So, having the chance to contribute and maybe help a little bit, was an attraction. But the main reason really was Governor Healy was very persuasive in her conversations with me about the opportunity to make a difference.
And tell us a little bit about that conversation. You said you had some concerns, but also I imagine would have to be a discussion about what's the role of the T Board. And just to give our listeners a little preface to that, there was a board before this one called the Fiscal and Management Control Board that was formed in 2015 after Snowmageddon shut down the Transit Authority for several days. And it was a very engaged, a lot of time spent by this board on getting the T back on its feet. And then it went out of existence and was replaced by a new board in the fall of 2021. And that board saw its role as being more reactive, stepping back and letting the T do what it needs to do. And now you're coming in that same board framework. But are you somewhere in between? Where do you lean as to what you want this board to do?
Well, I think that looking back kind of historically, as you say, there have been different formulations over the years. When I ran the T, the secretary was the board chair, and now the secretary is a member of the board, but not the board chair. So there have been different theories about how to best organize it. But I think that the governor has indicated that she wants an activist board, she wants a proactive board, she wants a board that's focused on safety and a board that's focused on accountability. And I think the people that she selected are consistent with that. Certainly, Senator McGee, who's former co-chair of the Transportation Committee in the legislature and former mayor, has a lot of experience in hearings and asking questions and stuff. And so, it's probably going to be a little bit more of a proactive. But the previous board, Betsy Taylor is my predecessor as chair. She's one of the most respected people in transportation finance in the country. So, it was a solid group before, but, new administration, new energy. And so I think you're going to see a little bit more of a proactive approach. Maybe, like you said, a little bit in between the most recent board and the Financial Management Control Board, which met weekly, and which, some people felt in terms of looking at it, that it was maybe a little bit of an intense involvement. And that staff had a hard time following up on the decisions that were made and getting ready for the next meeting a week later. So this is more the traditional model of meeting once a month.
So this week will be your first actual board meeting, but a week or so ago, there was the subcommittees of the board met, and you were on two of those, and the two members that joined with you are also on. And it seemed to, as someone who's a longtime observer, it did seem quite different at those subcommittee meetings. Members were asking lots of questions. There was talk about, do we need to spend more time on the financial subcommittee? There was a lot of, let's get something done here. Let's figure out how we can help. And I assume that set the tenor for what's coming?
Yeah, no, I would agree with your characterization. I did talk to each of the members beforehand to kind of get their assessment of how they wanted things to proceed. And that was consistent with a kind of a more activist approach. Plus, with any new board, you're going to have, more questions because people are on a learning curve. So in a way, it's a little unfair to compare the last meeting of the previous board with the first meeting of our board. But I do think that we've been encouraged to be more engaged and have a sense of urgency, which the passengers feel.
Yeah. And you asked a few questions at that financial meeting that so I'm used to the board members sort of asking questions about whatever's been presented, but you just asked sort of questions that you were interested in getting answers to. And one of them was how much big dig debt the T is carrying today.
Right.
Explain why you asked that.
Well, a number of people have asked me, and so I was kind of putting that issue on the table. I think, a rough analysis, because the staff is kind of digging into it now. So originally the T had about $3.6 billion of big dig debt. So for example, this year, there's about a $400 million deficit, and $200 million of that $400 million is because of the big dig debt, which it's still paying off. And the T still owes about $1 billion in big dig debt. So some people feel that while some of the debt was incurred to do things that were helpful to the T, some of it was incurred to be helpful to balance the books on the big dig. And since we're in a different financial time now than we were when those decisions were made, is that something worth taking a look at? So I just wanted to, kind of put that question on the table and give the staff a chance to, kind of sort through and see what they came back with. It's the kind of thing that, people who have been following transportation for a long time would be familiar, but a lot of new folks, wouldn't really be aware, might be a little bit surprised that there was big dig debt on the T books and that it was such a significant contributor to the T financial situation.
Yeah, I was aware of it, but I didn't know any details. And I remember looking up, and so as part of the mitigation for the big dig, the T was part of an effort, probably fairly broad effort to reduce traffic in a number of ways.
Right.
And I guess that was the rationale for why the T should absorb some of the debt related to the project.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of inside baseball here. I mean, there was the original agreement from December of 1990 with CLF, between CLF and the Secretariat, that laid out a number of mitigation measures. And then this decision, which was made in the mid-90s, was involved in kind of ratifying some of those earlier commitments, but also trying to figure out, how to close the books on the big dig. And so the Turnpike, had some obligations, the T had obligations, Massport had obligations. So they were just trying to spread it around so they could say that, the books were being closed. So there were kind of two elements.
I got you.
And
And is the thought sort of kicking around the back of your head that maybe the state should pick that up and as a sort of support for the T?
Yeah, I don't think that's a position that we've taken, but I know that's a position of some of the experts and advocates around town. But we haven't really discussed it, and we're still gathering the facts.
Okay.
I think it's being asked by some of the experts and advocates, with that in the back of their minds.
And what's your sense coming in of the T's financial status? Because I think you're going to be approving a budget at this coming meeting, or at least giving tentative approval to it. What's your sense of the T's financial status, does the board need to sort of focus on this issue pretty quickly?
Yeah, I mean, it's not perfect that we have to vote so quickly after we got appointed, but it'll either be this meeting or there may be a special meeting on June 8th if we don't get through all the analysis on the May 25th meeting. But it's probably the biggest single responsibility we have is voting for the budget and voting for the capital budget. So we want to make sure we get it right. The budget reflects people's priorities and aspirations, so people pay a lot of attention to it. And there's some significant changes under Governor Healy. About half of the increase, it's a little bit more than 6% increase, but about half of it's for safety, including adding about 600 positions that would be focused on, safety issues. So that's a big change. There's also $5 million that Governor Healy proposed for a discounted fare analysis. How would we really pull that off? So that's kind of a shift from the past. There's 176 new positions, so the Green Line extension can be fully staffed. So there are a number of things in there that are different. So we want to make sure everybody's had a chance to take a look at it. The questions that I was asking that you referenced before, so one was about the T police to make sure they are fully funded, and another question I asked was about elevators and escalators, and that's a perennial issue at the T, and you want to make sure that we have enough funding, because if an escalator or an elevator is out of service, they can deny somebody access. I was recently at the Charles MGH station, and there was a woman in a wheelchair, and I was praying that the elevator would work, and which it did. But if the elevator didn't work, then what's that woman going to do? So these are issues that affect our passengers, and we need to try to protect them from the ups and downs.
So I know there's the budget for the current fiscal year, but the T always somehow seems to scrape enough money together. Either they don't fill all the positions they're planning to fill, or they're using federal money, or they're shifting funds around in some way that they're able to balance their budget. But the prediction is coming that it's going to go in and slip into deficit, probably, unless there's some big turnaround in ridership. It's going to slip into deficit in the coming years. It could be quite large, depending on what happens with ridership. Is it your role to sort of advocate with the legislature, or is it just your role to tell the governor what you think as a board that we need to do?
Well, I think that's really up to the general manager, Phil Eng, who's doing a great job. He arrived pretty recently, but I think he's really, hit the ground running. And, and the secretary to figure out what role, if any, they want us to play in the advocacy. I mean, that can be part of our portfolio, but it really needs to be based on kind of whatever their game plan is with the governor. I think if they asked us to do something, we could be helpful. Mayor Koch from Quincy, Eric Goodwine from Worcester, Tom McGee from Lynn. We have a pretty good geographic distribution of folks who have different relationships with different decision makers. So it could be, but it's really up to Phil and the secretary and the governor to figure out what they want us to do.
Well, I'm going to push a little bit on that for them to figure out what you should do. You're the board, though. The secretary is part of your board. You're the chair of that board. The general manager reports in a sense to the board and to the Secretary of Transportation. So it does seem like your portfolio, you don't have to necessarily do whatever the governor wants you to do. You have a portfolio to oversee the T. And I'm pushing back a little bit on that notion.
Well, I mean, what you say is theoretically the case. I just think at the moment there are no indications that there's anything other than total agreement between the board that just got appointed, general manager, secretary, lieutenant governor, and governor. So, I mean, the governor has made the T a priority. She talks about it. She's visited facilities. I know it comes up, at most of her public events. So, it's not, sometimes in the past, the T was a low priority in some administrations, but that just isn't the case in this administration. So I wouldn't foresee any real major disagreements.
And yet I have yet to sort of see a longer term plan for how the T is going to, I mean, Philibang is struggling to fill enormous number of jobs. There's all sorts of operational issues he's trying to deal with, that are probably hampering efforts to get people back riding the T. So
Right.
he's got that on his plate. But I have yet to see some sort of long-term plan for, does some advocates say the T needs a lot more money and needs dedicated funds so it can do this and this and this and that. Others maybe say it's okay with the way it is. I'm not really sensing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's broad agreement that there is some kind of a fiscal cliff coming in 2026, whether it's the MBTA Advisory Board or the Mass Taxpayers Foundation or the Better City, or, broadly and across the spectrum, as you say. And that's going to require a conversation. Jim Rooney at the Greater Boston Chamber had proposed a mobility commission to kind of take a broader look. So, I think that's in the cards. I would say, because I've talked to General Manager Eng, a couple times about this, he is intending to kind of lay out after the first 90, 100 days kind of a game plan, which, will hopefully address some of the issues that you were raising about the longer term financial situations. So, I think there's a strong team in place at the T, in terms of the financial analytics and prescriptions. So I think he knows that's part of his portfolio, and I think he is planning to put something on the table in pretty near term.
Okay. And do you have a sense of where the T is on this whole issue with slow zones? I know they're starting to attack them through various closures and what have you, but I have yet to sort of hear we're going to be done with this by XYZ date, or really any sort of timetable for things. Have you gotten any briefing like that?
I mean, I would say we've gotten kind of a down payment on a briefing. I know he's spending a lot of time sorting that all out, because, there's the blue line, the orange line, the red line. He's got each one of those is a separate story. And I know that it's very frustrating for the passengers and the public in general. But he needs to be the one to kind of put a plan on the table that people can react to. And I know he's working on that, but I haven't been briefed in any amount of detail to be able to speculate on how that might look from a timetable point of view.
And I guess I'm just sort of echoing a little frustration, because you probably know this story as better than I do, that this sort of issue of things being wrong with the rails surfaced sort of inadvertently through a request for some records backing up some scans of the rails. And suddenly there was concern that they didn't have any backup, or whether these rail scans were ever acted upon or what have you. And it appears that there were scans and there were things that turned up wrong. And initially they shut almost the entire, not shut down, but slowed down almost the entire T. And then they've opened up a large chunk of it and now are working on smaller sections, which is going to take time, it looks like. But still no word on how this came about, and how long the rails were in bad shape and we were riding along fast. It seems like there should be some answers by this point. No? Am I wrong about that?
No, I think Phil is putting that together. I mean, he has the same questions that you have and that the passengers have. I think that the increased scrutiny is a good thing, but it makes people, want to double and triple check as they should. So in that instance, people may have seen some things that, they felt needed to be addressed in a more timely fashion. So, I think that's one of the biggest frustrations is the slow zones, and then the lack of a clear sense of when they may be resolved. And as I say, I know he's working on that. I know he has meetings on it every day. So he wants to be able to present a plan of when it's going to get resolved, and then explain kind of why it came to be.
Well, they hired someone to do a why it happened analysis, I think, on a 90-day contract. And I guess that's still going on. I don't know. Maybe these things take time. I guess they do.
Well, I mean, they do, but I think it's reasonable for the traveling public and passengers to want some answers, and I think that's his intention is to try to provide those answers and to try to make sure that we can stand by them, and that they will turn out to be what's promised, and not kind of over promising or feeling that there's pressure. So let's try to come up with something that is probably going to happen, but it isn't definite, and then it doesn't happen, and then there's a credibility issue, because obviously this administration is very committed to transparency, and I think they indicated that in a number of different ways, and and Phil is very comfortable with that, so he he's working to answer these questions.
Okay, so let me just ask you another little question about the board itself.
Yeah.
If my memory serves, the House proposed a slight tweak to the board. And one of the changes would be allowing the city of Boston to have a representative on the board.
Right.
That's obviously, it was a part of a budget document, so who knows where that will end up in the end. But do you think the city of Boston should have a seat on the board?
Well, there's a couple of different aspects to that question. So, when I was at the T, I talked to the city of Boston, Rick Domino, a couple times a week. I talked to him more than I talked to, most of the board members. So there are different ways of, having an influence on the decision making. Obviously, the mayor's made that a priority, and the governor has indicated an openness to looking at the legislation if it in fact passes. I think that the tricky thing, and why some folks, were not as enthusiastic in the earlier instance that you were citing, is there's a notion that when you're on the board, you're representing the interests of the whole T. So if the board becomes a constituency-driven organization, then does that change the way it's supposed to function? So a lot depends on who ends up sitting in the seats. And the other issue that came up before was the question, well, if you're adding, you need to have an odd number so you don't have ties. So if you're going to add one, you need to add two, and what other criteria for that second seat? And I think in the first go round, it was kind of an open seat, and then the more recent thinking is it would represent the other 170 cities and towns. But again, that's slides a little bit more in the direction of a constituency approach. So, these are legitimate, policy issues that need to get sorted out, in the legislature and with the governor and the mayor. But, I think there's a reasonable argument for taking a look at it for sure.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because Ray LaHood, the former U.S. Secretary of Transportation, who did a safety analysis for the T in 2019, I believe, he was, I think last year, testified that he doesn't like those constituency boards because for the very reason you mentioned, that they're looking out for whoever they represent and not the whole T.
There's a danger that it's not an automatic, but
It's not automatic.
That's
yeah.
the danger. Yeah.
But the flip side is that right now aside from a representative from the MBTA advisory board, which is currently the mayor of Quincy,
right,
it's all gubernatorial appointees. So it's sort of the question is whether this is enough critical thinking about what's going on. I'm sure that came up with the Healy administration, wondering what was Baker's board doing? Why weren't they doing more than they were? Something like that. But they all work for the governor. So that's the criticism the other way, that they really don't want to step out of line if until the governor says it's okay. So this independence or constituency representative is an interesting dynamic, I think, especially on a authority in crisis.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it really does depend on who you pick. And there are certainly people that the mayor could select, who have a lot of experience, in transportation and with boards and stuff. We kind of see the broader set of responsibilities. And other boards, have the same kind of dynamic. But so it just needs to get sorted out in the legislative process and with the governor. But I think it's high profile on the radar screen. So I think as you pointed out, it passed in the House before, I think the current thinking is a little bit different, so maybe it'll be more acceptable from the Senate point of view.
All right. Well, Tom, Glynn, thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate it, and all the best to you as chair of the MBTA board.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the chance to talk a little bit about some of the hopes and aspirations.
And to our listeners, we'll see you again next week. Thanks.